Okay, so it is actually the today is just because I couldn't remember the date. The second, yeah, the 2nd of September. So I had said before, I'm working ahead. I had attempt to. Well, now I'm getting there. And the reason I'm doing it for week 5 is this is our very important week. And I'm hoping it encourages you to work ahead because this is Addis. I mean, you're going to have a full week of regular work that we're already doing, and you're going to have develop at 1. Again, the more work you've done in these learn togethers, the more manageable this is going to be. Okay. So before I get into what I did to refactor for arrays and loops, and that's what you need to do for this learn together, of course, I just want to show you one change I made because I was thinking about it. And I went over this last week, so hopefully there's really nothing new here, except that I did modify that 75% of your code. That's not changed from 3, 4, 5, and 6. But on the 25% where I said you had to have 25% of your code, I kind of backed off that a little bit because I thought about it. And I decided that if you implement at least 3 new array or object methods or other functionality that we haven't covered, 3 instances, 3 examples, that will be fine. Okay. Because, I think I was looking at because I was looking at my code and I was trying to determine what would be 25% because now here's the other thing. In my code, I wrote quite a bit of code. But anyway, so in this week, I just want to say what you will do, and it shouldn't be a surprise, but I'm also not going to do 2 parts this week. It's just going to be refactoring from what you did last week with arrays and loops, from objects to including arrays and loops. And I'll show you what I did, of course, in my code, right? So, and then I went over that. Okay, so let me show you. Let me move over my code editor and go actually to the top. So I rewrote the documentation, but I'll give you a summary of what this says. A couple things was I took where I was including determining gameplay totals and wins out of the user object. So here are the user objects. I have 3 of them. And in this case, I included an ID that you'll see in a little bit why I did that. But I have 3 players. And here's probably the biggest difference is I set up a gameplay detail array. And so what I'm going to do in here, and I should document this, and I'm going to show you in my output, is it's actually going to have for each array, and it will be an object. And inside of that object will be the player ID, and it will be the selection the game did, the player, and the outcome, the result. Okay, so I've done that. I've also refactored the random method because I'm using it in a way I'll show you at the bottom where I'm going to call my code different times. So I refactored this a little bit. And then my get game choice was the same. The other thing I did is I decided to not use object methods just because it made my code a little wordy and I think a little harder to follow, right? So, and you can do this as well with your develop at 1. But and here's actually where when it figures out if it's a tie, who wins, who loses, then it pushes. So the push is the method on the array of that gameplay detail. And I get and this is actually what threw me off for a minute. I couldn't figure out why this didn't work. But when you're pushing an object into an array or into anywhere, because it's an object, you have to have the key, which is player, and the value, player.id. So I don't know why it was throwing me off, but it did. And then I got the result, player choice and game choice, because I wanted to record that detail. Okay, so but everything else about that, except it just looks cleaner, right? It just looks cleaner at that point. Okay, so down here, and this is where on my gameplay, and remember, I'm actually doing this the reverse of how it runs, so I'll kind of do the actual how it's called, how the code runs. in a minute, but you can see that on my gameplay, here's where I'm actually passing it my min and max, getting the result. And here's where I'm using a filter. So what I'm doing is every time the game is played, I'm actually, once I get the result, then I filter from that array of objects that I created up top. I'm filtering by each player. Okay, and this is one of the things you saw in Andrews, and he covered this a lot. And so for me, right, I went through that array. I filtered, but on each game, I said if the game.player, whatever, and the game.player in this case is the ID. And maybe I should just call it ID, but is equal to player that I'm passing in, right? That individual object, that individual player, not ID. And then what gets returned is my filtered, that was the result of that is my filtered by player. And then I call, that's another thing I refactored here is I actually ended up having a display game output and then a display game statistics. So now that I have my filter by player, I pass that with the result in the player name. Now, the reason I passed player name was so I didn't need to have that whole player object passed. I only need to have the name passed. Okay, and here's where I did some of my statistics. This is not that different, but in my game, after each game, I would pass the array that I was talking about, the result and the player name, and then I would just output. And what I did is I made sure I had all the statistics I had before. The one thing I needed to do here is once I'm passing the array, I'm actually passing all the games, so I had to figure out which ones were wins. So I actually had to do another filter and by wins here. Okay. And then here is my gameplay statistics. And in this case, I didn't need to pass anything into it because it was really only looking at that array, the gameplay details, and filtering by losses and ties. That was just pretty easy to figure out after that. So here's where I added some new functionality. I decided to make it play a little more fun, I think, which is really to play random times. So what I did is and this is the looping idea, right? So I have two examples of looping here. I have the filter and I have the way I'm playing. So I call get random integer between 1 and 11. The reason I chose 1 was so I could output the game 1, game 2, game 3, or whatever. And then I did a for loop starting at I equal 1. If I is less than equal to the number of games, and in that case, when it iterates, it adds 1. So it iterates over, again, a number of random times between 1 and 11, so 10 really. And in this case, what I'm doing is also I decided to do another random int, get random integer. And this was kind of the fun thing, is to actually repurpose, again, this get random integer that I use for my game. And now I'm using it for my play, the number of times. And in this case, I'm using it to pick one of 3 players. So this is really just to make it a little more fun. So then play random times. Again, this is called, and I've already walked you through, right, how it's going to call, because when it calls, first thing it's going to do once it figures out random number of times and it figures out the player, then it calls play game with that player, right? So up here, my play game that I've already gone over the idea. Right, but again, that's the bottom up, and I recommend using that style. I think it's really helpful to get organized that way. Okay, so let me just show you a run. Okay, so what I decided to do, the last thing here, let me make my a little bit larger, right? So here's actually that gameplay detail, right? Player, result, what the player picked, what the game picked, right? So you can see how many were here, right? So here are, and if I'd have to go back and look, you can see there were 8 games for this particular round. And it shows, this is the game statistics, and these are the these are the whole game statistics, and these are the individual game statistics outcomes. Okay, so now I hope that gives you an idea, right? So again, I use the idea of an array. So this is where I'm capturing, it's an array. Each entry is an object. And it's just, and there's multiple ways I went over and over in my head, like different ways. And that's what I love about choosing something new I haven't done before, because it really makes me realize how much time we can spend. And that's why, honestly, talking to somebody about your approach and just banging ideas away with them will help you. I noticed that what I did is I ended up several times trying to think about how I would do this. Like I originally thought, well, why don't I just capture in the object an array, and that would be those individual players detail. But I just decided after thinking about it, and I'm like, no, this is actually a more kind of, I think, a more realistic way of doing it. And not only that, not capturing those where I was trying to do, actually taking an initial setup of 0 games and then just figuring out incrementing. It really is better, and you see this more in real world where you're actually calculating those numbers based on some kind of transactional detail. So you would think, in a way, you think about the array is a list, right? So we're learning about how to store data in a list. Well, the most common type of list I think about is transaction data. In this case, a game transaction instance would be the individual gameplay. Okay, so what do I need to do? So that's it for this one. So what I need to do now is actually give some thought to what I'm going to do for my develop at one. For me, I've got almost all this now. The only thing I need to do is this 25% and doing the 3 new objects arrays methods or other JS functionality. So I'm going to give that some thought and think about what would make sense for my particular game. Okay, so I think it's about time to take off this draft. I think these are good. I think we've gone over them a couple times. So I think just to make this official, right? And I've published the schedule. I've talked about if you want to come talk to me, that during that week for the code review, right? Where's my link? Oh, I should put that link to the review. I think I had it last week. So, but one of the things I recommend, and that's part of why I put so many dates out there, is here in week 4 in our Learn Together, where I gave you the link. Let's see how many people. I know Jared at least. Oh, good, Oscar's on there, right? So I've put so many dates, probably more than we need, maybe not. I don't think so. We're down to about 24 of you, right? So, but the idea is that you come talk to me. The sooner you come talk to me, if you're having troubles, the sooner you come talk to me is going to be the better, because that will give you a chance to work on this, right? And again, because we have a compressed week during this week. I think I've done that enough. Anyway, talk to you soon. Bye.